UUCA is a community of faith which encourages and supports our individual spiritual quests, out of which we act together for social justice. This mission statement was written under the guidance of Dr. Edward Frost, who has led this congregation since 1989. Each fall, we begin our church year with a celebration called Ingathering. Designed to reunite our members after summer absences, it is a ceremony that Dr. Frost brought with him from congregations he had previously served.
The idea was that wherever people were, they collected little samples of water from the Grand Canyon or from the Great Smoky River or from the kitchen faucets, if that's as far as they'd gotten. And they bring them to the service on Sunday morning and pour them into a common urn.
The water is later used in our child dedication ceremonies to welcome our youth into a congregation with a remarkable history. This is the story of courageous people who were not afraid to stand up for their beliefs and who fueled the flame of liberal religion that still burns brightly today. When Sarah and George Boyd moved to Atlanta with their daughter Peggy in 1933, they had no trouble finding the church located at 669 West Peachtree Street.
We were sort of outcast, you know, and because there were very, very few Unitarians and liberal people living in Atlanta at that time. And we came down here and it was rural.
Unitarians and Universalists in Atlanta had joined forces in 1918 after an edict from the parent associations in Boston that said, "Unite or receive no more funding." Though it was called the United Liberal Church, the congregation remained divided on the issue of segregation. Dr. John Beck, who would soon become president of the congregation, recalls that in the 1940s, the low membership numbers reflected the mood of the group.
Well, it was not a happy congregation. There were some who wanted to be liberal with open door policy, some who were violently opposed to it, and it had to be subsidized. You couldn't get enough money to run the church, to have a minister. So it was just not a happy congregation.
In 1948, the now married Peggy Beard sat with her husband Roan in the sanctuary at 669 West Peachtree and witnessed an historic event.
I remember that day very well because I was there the day that a black man came to the church. He came and sat down right over here, right over on the right-hand side, not too far down. And it didn't bother me, and I didn't pay any attention to it, you know, because I had been used to being in integrated situations before, and I never didn't think anything about it. And then the whole church started. The minute church was over, all the old people were really buzzing around talking about that guy, you know. And then when he wanted, it was Domus, I think, who was the minister at that time. He, of course, he welcomed me. He was also a very liberal person, and so he didn't understand everything, and he didn't really realize, I don't think, that these people were serious. They did not want that gentleman to have anything to do with their church.
Within a few weeks, the Atlanta University professor, Thomas Baker Jones, applied for membership at the United Liberal Church. The board took a vote, and his request was denied. In a letter to his former minister in Ohio, Jones wrote,
"These deeply entrenched prejudices are very difficult to understand, and you get to the point that instead of being angry with the people, you find yourself feeling sorry for them. I was determined that I was not going to let them get me down. You know, I came by way of conviction, and I am more determined than ever before."
The American Unitarian Association in Boston had insisted that the United Liberal Church practice an open-door policy where persons of any race would be welcome. Since it was clear that the group in Atlanta was not living up to that standard, their minister, Reverend Isaiah Domus, resigned.
So this, of course, was what stirred up finally the national organizations. The church was owned jointly by the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America. They sold the church and put the money in escrow.
Both parent organizations urged that none of their Unitarian or Universalist ministers accept a position in the Atlanta church until it changed its discriminatory policy. With no place to meet, liberal religion in Atlanta was officially disbanded.
The segregationist people wanted to continue to meet, and so they moved and rented a place over at the Cox-Carlton Hotel, which was right up on Peachtree, diagonally across from the Fox Theater. And Joe Rayburn, who was a member of our church, and I don't know whether he was a real ordained minister or not, but he acted as their minister. And he was the one, I think, who kept that group together for I don't know how long. And then those of us who were so-called integrationists did not go anywhere during that time.
This was also the McCarthy era, and member Loretta Chappell was suffering another type of discrimination.
I'm not certain whether it was her boss or some member of the legislature that came into her office and saw on the shelf a copy of Mein Kampf, Hitler's treatise. And he saw that, and I suspect what happened is that he started looking around and he saw Communist Primer and some other books that had to do with communism. And this started the whole problem.
Loretta Chappell was brought before a Georgia Senate and House committee and was accused of being a communist sympathizer. She was defended by prominent attorney James Mackey, and people all over the state rallied to her defense, including church friends Kay and Bill Cherry.
They exonerated her, but it was an ugly situation, and she felt that it would reflect on her ability to do a good job in the Bureau of Family and Children's Services, so she resigned.
Years later, in her Atlanta Journal column that celebrated Loretta Chappell's 90th birthday, Celestine Sibley called her one of the bravest women I ever met. In 1952, the American Unitarian Association decided it was time to attempt a revival in Atlanta, so they sent down a new minister, the Reverend Glenn Canfield.
It was not until Glenn came down in 1952 that we actually started meeting again regularly, and that's when we started the Briarcliff Hotel. And Dr. Beck and my mother were the only two names of people that he was supposed to contact and get names of other people who would be interested. He was a very nice, calm, sweet fellow. And his wife, Betty, was a real minister's wife. She was real involved in women's groups and luncheons and stuff like that, trying to make a community of us,
But meeting in a hotel had its ups and downs. As the adults held church services in the dining room, Peggy Beard and Kay Cherry were in charge of the children upstairs.
When rooms were empty, the people at the desk would give us keys to different rooms, and that we would put the little ones down on the second or third floor, and then if we got one up on the 7th floor, we'd put the 5th and 6th graders up there and everything. And so we lost some people sometimes because we would not know which class we'd put where.
Shortly thereafter, Glenn Canfield introduced a radical concept called the talkback. After the sermon, church members would ask him questions and discuss the sermon's content.
The talkbacks were a very important thing, I thought. They made a big hit with people. Mm-hmm. Here's a bunch of Unitarians that got their own ideas, and they had a chance to talk and tell their own feelings after the services. So that became quite popular.
members continued to pay a price for belonging to a church with unpopular views.
When there was some publicity given to him and his activities there, would be something in the paper about it, he might get a call from one of his older patients saying, "Oh, Dr. Beck, that's not you that I saw in the paper." "Well, yes, ma'am, it really was." "Well, I can't come to somebody who carries on like that." And my uncle's response would be, "Well, if that's how you select your physicians, perhaps you had better find another one."
And Jim Crow laws got in the way of a welcoming congregation.
We did have a fine young Negro woman friend of ours attend one Sunday, and nothing was said. Then next week, another Negro friend called to express the wish her 2 daughters could attend our church school. When the hotel manager learned of this, he explained that the children and their mother would be forbidden the use of the main elevators to our classrooms, since there's a rule that no Negroes can ride these elevators except the operator.
In just a few months, the manager asked the congregation to leave, saying that they needed the space for other events. In 1953, the group found a new home. The members of the Mormon Church, located on the corner of North Avenue and Boulevard, agreed to share their building for a year while they built on a new site. While the Mormons held services in the mornings,
We met in the afternoons, but we could never have coffee or tea or anything like that. We had Kool-Aid, which was terrible, and and we respected their wishes, about that. And that was for a whole year that we did that. And you'd always see people smoking outside. They couldn't smoke inside either.
in 1954, the 127 members of the United Liberal Church officially purchased the building on Boulevard. On January 20th, a vote was taken to ratify the new church constitution. Article 4 on membership stated that any person, regardless of any distinction, such as race, color, nationality, or station in life, who is in agreement and in sympathy with the purpose as stated in Article 2, is eligible for membership in this church and shall become a member upon signing the Statement of Basic Principles of the Church. On December 12, 1954, Whitney Moore Young, Dean of the Atlanta School of Social Work, joined the first integrated church in Atlanta. Now that the building was theirs, members got down to the business of making it more comfortable.
I happened to be at that time the renovation chairman, and I remember I'd go out during the week when I had time and buy the paint and get it down to the church and then call up people to come down on Saturday and paint.
I remember it particularly because it had a baptismal tank built into the lower level of the church, and it had boards over it, so we didn't use it at all.
One day we went in there and the doors were just kind of floating like this, and the water was leaking, and it was filled up. It was stopped up somehow, and it was filled up, and the doors were just floating on top of it. And so they always said, who said a Unitarian couldn't walk on water? That was all very funny, huh?
In 1955, a new subcommittee was formed, the Support for the League of Women Voters and Improvement of Race Relations. That first year, membership at the United Liberal Church climbed by 41%, up to 181 members. To celebrate, the congregation hosted a first anniversary dinner in the church basement. 92 members attended, including Loretta Chappell, Whitney Young, Kay Cherry, Bill Cherry, and Roz Ryman, who was known for her colorful attire. In April 1956, a 3-day weekend meeting was held in Atlanta for 200 delegates of the Georgia Universalist Council. The conference was opened by the minister of the Unitarian Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Reverend Edward Cahill. The group drafted a message to President Eisenhower and other public officials calling for meetings of white and Negro leaders to seek just solutions to the problem of segregation. When the United States Supreme Court handed down the Brown versus the Board of Education verdict in 1954, most of Atlanta recoiled at the thought of truly desegregating schools. Even the Georgia state legislature was against it. But the United Liberal Church took a stand by establishing an Education for Action group and opening a youth center for the neighborhood. On March 26, 1957, Edward Cahill was installed as minister of the United Liberal Church. The event drew media attention for the prominent figures who participated in the ceremony. Opening words were spoken by church member Rufus Clement, president of Atlanta University. The sermon was delivered by Frederick May Elliott, president of the American Unitarian Association, and a hearty welcome was given by the mayor himself, William B. Hartsfield. Several months later, a reception was held in Reverend Cahill's honor at the Avondale Estates home of Coe and Betty Hamling.
They sent out invitations, and among the people who came were two black couples.
One of the couples was Dr. Cunningham, who was president of one of the black colleges. Well, you know, everything was fine until we got ready to leave. But by that time, there were people standing across the street, neighbors and people, and they'd call the police.
There wasn't any group movement. There's some cars went by in the subsequent days. The way you could tell the way they drifted by there and all looked in our house that this is the place where all this happened. What a horrible incident. Blacks and whites together.
And in the backwash of that afterward, some of the people who were in positions to do so organized sort of a blacklist boycott kind of thing against Coe, and saw to it that he lost a lot of his business connections, and really made life pretty tough for Coe for quite a while.
After attending the reception, Church Treasurer Morgan Stanford found that his position as city attorney for Avondale Estates had changed.
The city didn't want Morgan to be representing them legally, and he was asked to resign, and he did.
It even affected Coe at church.
He came to board meeting and said that he was going to have to resign from the church.
And Whitney Young was there, and Whitney, bless his heart, was on our board as a champion of this whole big movement of desegregation. And when I suggested that I should resign from the board simply because for the safety of the church, because I had no idea what some of these people were going to do, they were quite upset about it. He was upset that I would resign from the board. And I tried to explain to him that I wasn't worried about myself, but I was really worried about the church.
As a librarian for the Avondale schools, Betty Hamling felt a great deal of resentment from people around her.
So I was asked to resign, and I did. It hurt, but Jim Cherry, who was head of the school board, came to me and apologized. And
their children also felt the repercussions.
Our oldest daughter, out of our 5 children, lost a number of friends in high school. In fact, at one point, they spit upon her in the hall at her high school.
In Atlanta's tense racial climate, it took courage to be associated with a church that favored integration.
Ron Beard worked at Georgia Tech when I was there. He worked for the Alumni Association, and they actually asked him if he would leave the church. They didn't like his being associated with a church which had both black people and white people.
He just completely ignored it and wasn't going to make a difference to him. He was going to continue to go to the church, and so we didn't know if he was going to get fired or what, you know. And you know, it just was maddening to be told that, you know, that you shouldn't go to a particular church.
The talkbacks that had begun with Glenn Canfield continued to thrive under Edward Cahill, but some women of the church wished their outspoken husbands would tone it down a little.
You know, every time he stood up in church, I would just think, oh my goodness, what's he going to say now? You know, because he had a great sense of humor, and he would, no telling what he was going to say.
With racial issues splitting the community, in 1959, members Elizabeth and Jerry Reed responded by helping to organize a citywide group called HOPE, Help Our Public Education. When they held their first meeting, over 1,000 people showed up. Ed Cahill made the church's position clear by delivering sermons calling for racial equality and an end to segregation in schools.
More is at stake here than just the public schools. Our democratic way of life is on trial. In democracy, there are no superior races. The principles of equality are basic and apply to all people.
Ed Cahill's sermons were the prime reason that Dan Hollums joined the church in the late 1950s.
Ed Cahill was a charismatic speaker, a wonderful performer in the pulpit. He took positions that few people were taking, and he tried hard to get in the newspapers, I think, and he did.
The United Liberal Church was becoming known for its bold views. In 1960, the youth groups of the United Liberal Church and Ebenezer Baptist Church held integrated meetings every other Sunday night.
And one time, the Ku Klux Klan, somebody called and threatened the minister's wife over the phone, said that it wasn't allowed to have black and white kids together, and that they were going to do something about it. So Coretta Scott King was in charge of the youth group, and she said, well, that they should go ahead and meet anyway. The parents were all called to say that this had happened. They'd had this phone call, but everybody showed up, and all the men, the fathers, made a ring around the church and stayed outside to protect the kids while they met inside.
Roan Beard and I walked guard outside the church. I had a pistol in my belt. I'm not proud of that, and in retrospect, I think it was probably a pretty bad mistake to do that, because something could have happened and I might have used it, and that would have been very unfortunate. But anyway, I did. And so Roan and I were just walking guard on the sidewalk outside the church. And the police had been notified about this and about the threats that we'd received. And we did have a police car occasionally come by, but not often. It was once or twice maybe they made a pass by. We did see other cars come by, and there were rough-looking characters in those cars, and it was warm. They had this windows down, and they were looking at us in menacing ways. And so Roan and I just kept walking, and we walked back and forth by the rear entrance of the church and occasionally around to the front. And no one ever yelled at us or said anything to us, but we felt we knew who these people were because they would drive by very slowly and they would stare at us, you know.
Church membership was rapidly growing, and it soon became clear that the North Avenue building would not contain them for long.
In many ways, it was a very good location because it was down in the area, a transitional area where there were both blacks and whites, and it was a good place to be, to sort of be the pioneer in integrating the two communities.
In 1960, the Site Selection Committee released the results of a survey that projected growth through the year 1970, and found that membership was centered in an area east of the Fulton-DeKalb County line, south of La Vista, and the Northeast Expressway. Since members were drawn from a wide area, the committee recommended locating a site near the highway. Considering the difficulty a liberal church is likely to encounter in finding a socially compatible location, they suggested a search for commercial property. In the summer of 1961, Ed Cahill submitted his resignation and moved on to a congregation in Pittsburgh. The fall months found the pulpit filled by civil rights activists such as Andrew Young, John Lewis, and Rabbi Jacob Rothschild from the Temple. On December 31, 1961, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a sermon entitled Remaining Awake Through a Revolution. The next minister of the United Liberal Church was called from Richmond, Virginia in the spring of 1962, the Reverend O. Eugene Pickett.
Gene was so devoted. I've never known anybody any more devout in his service to a church. If the rug were dirty, he'd probably get a broom and clean it, you know.
I liked the fact that Gene cultivated the arts. He was very good at advancing the role of arts in church life with plays, and of course Mary Nell Santa Croce was very much involved in that sort of thing.
The thing that I introduced was more variety in the Sunday service. We had drama, and poetry, more music and whatnot, and so we had a more varied Sunday morning program.
When he was asking you to do something, you know, I think, oh no, and he said, oh sure, you can do that, Peggy, you know. He just was that kind of person, and you'd end up doing it.
He was really appalled at the condition of that building, and he went about even fixing some of it himself. I mean, he was cleaning things up and patching plaster and stuff like that. He was just appalled at the building. And he was involved in all kinds of administrative things and getting the committees to function better and organizing the church a lot better.
In May, the church was approached by a group that was interested in purchasing the building.
I know that the Muslims wanted to buy, the black Muslims, and there was a lot of discussion back and forth, and they finally ended up refusing to sell to them.
Gene Pickett sent a letter to the Unitarian Universalist Association saying that he believed that the majority of the congregation voted against the sale because the separatist Muslim group believed in racial superiority.
The feeling was that we didn't want to support a group that was primarily a segregationist group, even though it was a black group.
They also felt that the church's Negro neighbors did not want such a divisive group in their midst.
When I thought about it later, I thought the black Muslims had a good social program. They worked in the community well. They had self-help programs, and that possibly, if we were really thinking of the neighborhood and the community, that they would have been more helpful to that community than a gas station on the corner there.
As the months went on, the search for a new building site continued.
We were desperately seeking a site, and it was difficult to find because the Unitarian Church was not held in high regard in the community.
During the summer, a property became available on Shady Valley Drive in a residential neighborhood near the intersection of Lenox Road and Buford Highway.
The first piece of property was like 10 acres, which would have allowed for really a nice space, parking and all the rest. And that's when we got, when one of the aldermen really objected.
The United Liberal Church was denied use of the site by the Atlanta City Council after Alderman Buddy Folks said he feared that the integrated church would lower the moral tone of the neighborhood. In the fall of 1962, the church building was sold to an oil company, and the congregation needed a new place to meet. In her book, From Southern Wrongs to Civil Rights, activist Sarah Mitchell Parsons noted that Gene Pickett asked for her help in getting permission to meet in the Clark Howell School on 10th Street. As the first woman on the Atlanta City School Board, she knew that despite the federal mandate for integration, another policy, well known but unwritten, said that Atlanta's public schools could not be used as meeting places for blacks and whites together.
Sarah was aware of this, and I think she tells that she had talked to the superintendent saying, just don't bring this up when it comes before the school board. But she evidently didn't, and so we got the space.
But in the Clark Howell School, the congregation again found themselves in very temporary quarters.
We had to come early on a Sunday to set it up for services, and then we had to stay after services and tear it all down and leave it as we had found it.
And Gene would get there early. He was always there, sweeping the place and cleaning it out.
We had to pick up our songbooks after every service and put them in a box. We had casters on it and roll around. We had to clean up the place so it would be usable for the school the next morning after our Sunday services.
As a newcomer to the church in 1963, Boyd McCowan joined the ushering committee and one day got a surprise.
As the new kid on the block, I felt like I needed to make some sort of contribution. So, you know, I could ush. And so my first Sunday ushering was a lesson in UUism. We had all the setup done, and I was standing at my door at the rear of the auditorium, handing out programs or whatever. And just as the service started, here came this reprobate, I guess one would say, a really shaggy, shabby hobo. And he walked in my door. And I looked around, what am I supposed to do about this? I know what would happen in a Protestant church. There would have been, at that time, there would have been, the ushers would have taken charge of the situation and shielded the congregation from this objectionable personage. Not only did he walk in my door, to my astonishment, he walked right down to the front and sat down on the front row. And I'm chagrined. I've neglected my duty. What should I do now? And I looked over at the other ushers, and they were not concerned, you know. And finally, I went over and I asked one of them, "What do we do about this?" He said, "Oh, that's Joe. He comes any Sunday he's in town. He comes to our church."
The search for a permanent building site continued.
There was a newspaper in Atlanta, one of the weekly suburban newspapers, called the North Side News, owned and edited by a fellow named Matt Perkins. And Matt Perkins really took up the hue and cry against the United Liberal Church. And he wrote scurrilous editorials and supposed news stories, excoriating the United Liberal Church as a bunch of communist sympathizers.
The term blockbusting referred to an area that was being integrated against its wishes.
He got to a point in his newspaper, it was almost every issue, he had something in there about our church. And much of it was just out and out lies. And he reached a point where we felt we had to do something about him.
So they sent 3 emissaries to speak with the editor of the North Side News, church president Harry Adley, attorney Morgan Stanford, and vice president Dan Hollums.
And we very carefully and amicably, without any threats or anything, discussed with him a bunch of the articles that we had clipped. And we said, look, this is factually wrong. We just want you to know what the facts are. And then as we went along, we refuted all these things that he'd been writing about us. And Morgan, in his very quiet but very firm and authoritative way, suggested subtly, but not too subtly, that there could be legal repercussions if this did not change. And by golly, when we got through, he shook hands with each of us, and he said, I understand your position. I don't agree with you on everything, but I understand your position. And we did not have any more of those articles in the North Side News. It really worked out.
The paper printed a negotiated retraction of the article, complete with a list of famous UUs. In March of 1963, a Public Issues Committee was created. In December, it expanded into areas of social justice and urged members to report instances of noncompliance with the Supreme Court school prayer decision. Despite the odds, in late 1963, a commercial building site was found. Outside the Atlanta city limits in DeKalb County, it was next to the highway on an undeveloped tract of land. The next task was to design the building.
The firm was Toombs, Amasano, and Wells. And Joe Amasano, a principal in the firm, came up, I think, with a concept.
The first design was way over budget and got a terse reaction from one church member.
It was a rough kind of a building with a lot of exposed masonry and that sort of thing inside and out. And Roan Beard's famous comment was, "It looks like Mexican ruins to me." The architect did not appreciate it.
The project was turned over to architect Tom Vincilette, who finessed the design to accommodate the congregation's needs.
The round sanctuary was unique and still is. The reason for that, I was told, was that then we had a talkback session, and the round sanctuary facilitated everyone being able to see everyone else.
On January 10, 1965, members assembled for a groundbreaking.
It was a cold, windy day, I remember very well, and we were all standing around outside.
Despite the conditions, a Negro crowd attended the Sunday afternoon event. Statements were made by church president Ray Levine, Harry Adley, and Gene Pickett. Representing the congregation's youth, Jeffrey Beard, son of Peggy and Roan Beard, took a turn with the ceremonial shovel.
Somebody had hot coffee in a truck. We had coffee. We're Unitarians. We had coffee. You know.
Then there was another question: what to call the new building?
The first thing we decided in that committee was we ought to have it Unitarian-Universalist. And our first thought was Unitarian Universalist Church of Atlanta. But then we did some soundings, and we found that we had quite a few Jewish members who reacted adversely to using the word church. They said, many Jews aren't comfortable with joining a church. And I said, well, what about congregation? Oh, yeah, that's fine. So the committee decided it would be Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta.
Construction lasted almost a year, and the project came in at a cost of $465,000. In that year's annual report, Interior Design Committee Chair Bill Pilgrim noted, "It has been our aim to make our building not only the most usable and useful church building in the city, but also one of the most beautiful." The building design won 2 national architectural awards. On January 2, 1966, 12 years after the rebirth of the congregation, the first service was held in the new building at 1911 Cliff Valley Way. An art show and a music recital helped highlight the opening.
Sarah and I just felt like we were being enfolded. Oh, it just washed over us, and we cried. It was a very emotional experience.
The people of the United Liberal Church set the stage for the UUCA members of today. Many have walked through these doors. Many spirits have been lifted. And Dr. Edward Frost reminds us that as we reach out to the community, we must not forget our personal inward journey.
I think there is a sense of we-ness about this congregation that is unique in large congregations. There is a growing sense of community. We have some enormously talented people here. I think it's a congregation that doesn't have any serious sense of lack of possibility. I think people who get involved in religious community do make a difference in the world. But the purpose of religious community is religion, religious growth, spiritual growth.
UUA President William Sinkford agrees.
The real good news here is liberal religion. It is the good news of a faith tradition that honors individual searching, that can accept individual identity with all of its complexity, that does not punish anyone for who they are. The good news is that there is a liberal religious way to be in the world, which calls us to pay attention to many things, but it grounds and supports us in trying to find a way to live a good life, which is fundamentally what religion is all about.